Good to see everybody. How are we doing? Good. Hey, thank you guys so much for praying for me and my family after the death of my mother. Those things, they went as well as they can go. And the biggest heartache I have right now is for my dad. They were married 61 years and actually still really liked each other. We're deeply in love. And after she got ill, he never left her side. Funerals are just weird. When someone dies, you're immediately thrust with all these responsibilities, all the things you have to take care of, and all of a sudden family comes piling into town, but then all of a sudden everybody leaves, and that's when you have to do the hard work. So we're trying to get him to come up here and hang out with us and maybe, kind of fall in love with the Finger Lakes and want to stay. But right now he's not quite there. But if you continue to pray for my dad, his name is Jack. And again, thank you so much for praying for me. So this morning we are starting a brand new series on a subject that seems to fascinate us. People that I talk to, even people that aren't of faith, love to talk about the so-called end of the world. Okay? There's a great song, "The End of the World as I Know It," that was really big, I think, in the 90s or the 2000s. And it's a subject that if you go to bookstores, you'll see it listed time and time again. I don't know why I do this, but occasionally I'll surf through the religious channels on the TV, and they're always full with all these predictions of doom, and, well, this person is this, and this person is this, and this is going to happen. It's a fascinating subject. But I hope I've convinced you by now that the Bible doesn't really teach that the world is going to end, okay? That really reference comes from once in the King James Version. Jesus says, "I'll be with you until the end of the world." It's a mistranslation of the Greek. He says, "I'll be with you until the end of the age," okay? Good Jews, good Christians believe that God was committed to his good creation. And so what we believe is that an age is going to end, then when God will recreate the world, a new heaven and a new earth, the book of Revelation says. So until then, our job is to hang in there, okay? So when people think about the end of the world, they naturally go to the book of Revelation. So if you brought a Bible, we're going to get there in just a second. I'm not going to preach this whole time, just a few minutes, and then we're going to sing some more, and then teach some more, and then close with a communion around the tables this morning. But the book of Revelation is a fascinating book. I have to say it's probably one of the most misunderstood books in the Bible, okay? Now, I'm not going to stand before you this morning and in these coming weeks and say I've got it right, but to say that there is a way to understand this book that makes a lot more sense to us. Now, here's what all good Jews and Christians believe, that history is moving forward, okay? Moving towards some kind of a culmination. All right, the theological word for that is eschatology. The Greek word eschaton means end, but not end in like, well, that's it, game over. End as in terminus, as in completion, as in fulfillment. We all believe that history is moving forward, and the book of Revelation takes that very, very seriously. The book of Genesis says that when the world started out, things were good. All right, the book of Revelation is going to tell us when it's all said and done, things are going to be good. But in the meantime, things can get pretty rocky. Things can get pretty difficult. And that's why John wrote this amazing, amazing book. Now, the book of Revelation falls under a genre or literary type called apocalypsis. Okay, that's a Greek word, apocalypsis or apocalypse, that has some very, very specific ways of going about things and things we have to know about it. Some characteristic of apocalyptic literature. First of all, that word just means unveiling, okay, or revealing. And we've come to think that it means tragedy or catastrophe. Oh, it's going to be an apocalypse, right? And it doesn't mean that at all. It just means there's going to be some kind of revealing. Apocalyptic literature appears in the book of Daniel. You'll see that a lot. Some in Isaiah, some in Ezekiel, some in Zechariah, but the book of Revelation probably has the most characteristics of this apocalyptic kind of literature. All right, it's always written based on some kind of a vision or a dream that a prophet or a seer has, okay? So in this case, it's St. John has this vision, has this some kind of experience that's otherworldly when he sees all these amazing things. Here's the key to understanding the book of Revelation in all apocalyptic literature. It's always written in an environment of suffering. Okay? So when you read it, you have to understand that. So if your life is perfect and sunshine and roses, then when you read the book of Revelation, you're going to say, what is all this about? Okay? But if you're going through it, you have some difficulties, some hardships in your life, then the book of Revelation is written just for you. Now, the persecution that the church faced came from a lot of places. Mostly it came from the government, okay? It came from the Roman Empire. We'll talk more about this as we go. But under the Emperor Nero, the Christians were really, really persecuted. They were tortured. They were stuck on stakes and lit on fire to be human torches. Just a terrible, terrible time for the church. A little later, under a guy named Domitian, he was the one who said, you guys must worship me as God. So he took it to an even deeper level. So because of this, the book of Revelation wants to criticize the existing governments. They want to say these people are out of control. Well, if you did that, you'd be in trouble. You might be arrested. You might be tortured. You might be killed. So they spoke in code words. They spoke in little word pictures, little metaphors, little examples that seem so bizarre to us, but that would have made perfect sense to the people who were hearing these words or reading these words. So we don't need to obsess about what 666 means. When I flew down to my mom's funeral, the price for my plane ticket was $666. Thought, some of you would have said, cancel it, right? We don't need to worry about what 666 means. We don't need to try to figure out what all these strange creatures mean. We just need to understand that the people who read this book would have understood, and that the author is writing in code so he doesn't get himself or his audience into trouble. Now, one more thing we have to understand the book of Revelation, okay, it's this. There are 404 verses in the whole book, all right, 404 verses. In those 404 verses, there are 518 references to other biblical material, okay? Why is that important? It means you're not going to understand the book of Revelation unless you're familiar with everything that came before it. So you see people who obsess about this book and they'll pick it up and they'll want to build a whole faith based on the book of Revelation. You can't do it unless you understand or at least familiar with everything that came before it, because there are references and allusions time and time again to Hebrew scriptures, to some Christian scriptures. So we have to keep that in mind, that this is a book that doesn't give us a lot of new information. What it gives us is new ways of looking at the hardships of life. It's written more in the genre of poetry. Think about poetry doesn't necessarily give you a lot of new information. It just gives you a new way of looking at things. And such is the case with the book of Revelation. Written by John, it says. Some debate over who that is. Probably it's just the John who wrote the Gospel of John, the letters. Probably the same guy. He was in charge of a group of churches that revolved around Ephesus. Okay, 7 churches around there. He was kind of their pastor, wrote to them, took care of them. Got in trouble under the Roman Empire, got sent to this island named Patmos, okay, which is just kind of not too far from Ephesus, was kind of known as a prison, kind of an island, a place where they sent people, and that's where John found himself. It was a time when the church was really, really struggling. He was discouraged, and when that happened, he gets this amazing vision. So let's look at that. Chapter 1. Let's start at verse 9. He writes this, I, John, your brother and fellow partaker in the tribulation, right, there you go, there's that suffering, in the kingdom and perseverance which are in Jesus, was on the island called Patmos because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. I was in the Spirit. In other words, I had this vision. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice like the sound of a trumpet saying, write in the book what you see and send it to the 7 churches, to Ephesus, to Smyrna, to Pergamum, to Thyatira, to Sardis, to Philadelphia, and to Laodicea. Then I turned to see the voice that was speaking with me, and having turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands. And in the midst of the lampstands, I saw one like the Son of Man, clothed in a robe reaching to the feet and girded across his chest with a golden sash. His head and his hair were white like white wool, like snow, and his eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze when it had been made to glow in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of many waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and out of his mouth came a sharp, two-edged sword, and his face was like the sun shining in its strength. So let's ponder that crazy vision for a minute. Think about that, and remember that this book is written not to scare us, but to encourage us. To say, when life starts, it's good. When it ends, it's going to be good. The middle's kind of tough, but we can find comfort in what God is doing. So let's think about that for a minute, as Emily leads us in another song. We would think, you guys can sit back down, if we give our heart to God, if we give our soul, if we give our lives to God, then life should go well, right? That's not always the case. We can think that, but that's not always the case. Life can be very, very difficult. Just looking around, our little church this morning, I know some of the things you guys are wrestling with. Life is hard. And again, that's why we have something like the book of Revelation. Say, yes, life is hard, but God is doing something. Maybe it's something we can't perceive or can't understand, but it's something that's going to be big and give us a reason to be hopeful. So the book of Revelation paints this picture for us. I don't know how many of you are fans of art. I like what I like, and I'm not an expert or an aficionado, but of course I'm a big fan of Van Gogh. I think we've got a picture of his that you've probably all seen, Starry Night, okay? Legend has it that Van Gogh was in an insane asylum at this time, and he looked out his window and that's what he saw, and so he painted it. And he's under that category of painters that you'd call impressionistic. That's not really a literal picture of what it looks like to look outside your window, but that was the impression that Van Gogh got that evening, and he painted that beautiful picture. And so when John paints some of these pictures, they're impressionistic. They're not exactly replicas of what maybe something looked at, but what he saw in this amazing vision. And so the first thing he says is, I heard this sound like a trumpet, very, very dramatic. And he said, I turned around to look, and I saw one like the Son of Man. Now, easy for us to hear that word and let it just kind of roll off our back. Doesn't mean a whole lot to us, but it's a phrase, Son of Man, that's packed with all kinds of meaning. You may recall that Jesus often referred to himself as the Son of Man. In the Gospels, he did that. The Son of Man this, the Son of Man that. And some folks have said it's just his way of saying, I'm just like you. I'm just a human being like you, a son of man, a daughter of man. Some say that, but really it's a word that is filled with all kinds of ideas. Let me read to you from the book of Daniel that kind of paints a picture for us. Daniel describing a vision he had, and listen to what he says. It's in chapter 7. He said, I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming, and he came up to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all the peoples and nations and men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away. His kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. So when the people thought about this character, the Son of Man, he was quite a guy, okay? Daniel gives us this beautiful picture. In fact, Jesus said, you'll see the Son of Man coming in the clouds. A direct quote from that passage in Daniel, which was so important to the people of Israel. So when they thought about the Son of Man, it would be somebody that would be strong, okay? Somebody that would be powerful, somebody that would fill all of creation with this amazing energy, and more importantly, somebody who would restore Adam to his proper place as God's image reflector. And important for us, all of Adam's descendants would be restored to who they were supposed to be. Okay. Now this idea got really developed in a period we would call the intertestamental period, after we have Malachi, before we begin to get Mark. The earliest of the Gospels are the Pauline letters. And it's most developed by a writer that you've probably never heard of, a guy named Enoch. There's a lot of literature out there about God, about Jesus, that the church doesn't necessarily accept as authoritative, not because it's false, but because it really wasn't used that often in their church settings. Sometimes called pseudepigraphal, not because it's false, but because attributed to authors that may not have written it. But Enoch was the one who supposedly wrote this book about the Son of Man in all of his power, in all of his might. But then Jesus comes along and takes this title for himself, the Son of Man. And people looked at him and said, he seems like an ordinary guy. He's a rabbi, an itinerant rabbi, went from town to town. He's from Nazareth. It's like saying you're from Gorham or something, nothing big, there. Not that impressive. And he talked about loving people and forgiving people and serving people. In fact, when it came time when he was arrested, he didn't call thousands of angels down to his side. Instead, allowed himself to be arrested and crucified. So the first followers of Jesus had to come to terms with this idea of here's our expectations of the Son of Man, and yet here's what he looked like. And they did that. And so when John is writing, he's writing to a second generation of Christians, maybe a third generation even, who'd been used to this. They've gotten this teaching. They've seen this Jesus that is humble and forgives and loves. And yet John is now saying it's time for us to remind each other that the Son of Man is in fact powerful, that he is in fact God's chosen, that he is the one to restore things to God's initial vision. The people being persecuted, being tortured, being excluded from their synagogues, being excluded from their cultures, from their society, not allowed to buy goods, not allowed to sell goods. John's telling them that yes, the rabbi we follow is humble and gentle, but he is still this amazing person that we call and believe as the Son of Man. And then he goes and gives us a description that if we don't know the Bible seems vague, it seems innocuous, it seems totally irrelevant, but it paints a picture that the first readers would have recognized very, very quickly. He talks about this Son of Man figure wearing a robe reaching to his feet, girded across his chest, it says, with a golden sash. Okay, I almost wore that this morning, but I decided, to wait to that. A long robe with some translations say a girdle, not man spanks or anything like that, but something, going across his waist. Weird to us, but you know what the readers heard? A priest. That is the clothing of a priest. You can go back and read about Aaron in the book of Exodus, and you said, okay, he's talking about a priest here. The Son of Man is a priest. Now, don't get tripped up on your visions of what a priest is, or your memories, maybe if you're a recovering Roman Catholic, of what the priest did. This kind of a priest they had so much respect for. A priest mediated between human beings and God, represented human beings to God, represented God to human beings. It was a role that they saw as so important. And they were used to it might be Dave, might be the high priest one year, then it might be Jeff. They were used to it being human beings. And yet John said, when I heard this sound like a mighty trumpet and I looked to see, I saw this priest that was the Son of Man. Which means it's not somebody imperfect, it's somebody perfect. Not somebody we need to be afraid of. Yes, we're in awe of, but we don't fear, we don't dread, because this Son of Man is what? The union of the divine and the human in the person of Jesus, brought and sent to bring us back to God. It says his head and his eyes, his head was and his hair were white wool, white as snow. Okay, it's true of all the best people, isn't it? The best people have the white hair. Yeah, I'm kidding. And again, you might think what a vague little reference there. What did white represent? Purity, right? Yeah. Isaiah said, your sins, they're like scarlet, but they will be white as snow. David prayed, Lord, wash me with hyssop, and I will be white as snow. The people who read this vision would have heard that, and they'd have heard that this great high priest, this great Son of Man, is pure, okay? And he adds next to it about his eyes. He said his eyes were like fire. Now, sometimes don't you get fire eyes at your kid? You know, you're looking at them, you're like, I'm zapping you if I could right now, and I'd melt your brain like scanners or whatever that was. It's not like that, okay? It's this beautiful picture. What does fire represent in the Bible? Refining, right? This idea of burning away that which doesn't belong there. So he's saying this Son of Man, this priest, this pure person looks at us. And he doesn't say, you know what, you're a bunch of worthless goofballs. He doesn't just look at us, he looks into us. And the fire of God it's a powerful metaphor. It appears over and over again, but it's one that's meant to encourage us. There's an author from the 18th century named George MacDonald. I'd never really heard of him until I started reading C.S. Lewis. And C.S. Lewis said, I never wrote a book where I didn't have George MacDonald in mind. I'm like, wow, that's important to me. And he has a quote that I want us to look at because it's so powerful. Can I get that next quote? No. A long quote from George MacDonald. Okay, if we don't have it on the screen, Oh, we have it? Okay, good. He says this, He has got a consuming fire that only that which cannot be consumed may stand forth eternal. Okay, remember that. He's a consuming fire just so everything that can't be consumed will still be there. It is the nature of God so terribly pure that it destroys all that is not pure as fire. He will have purity. Okay, that sounds scary, right? He will have purity. It's not that the fire will burn us if we do not worship Him, but that the fire will burn us until we worship Him. Okay? Do you hear the difference there? And it's not a literal fire. You're not going to get set on fire, okay? It's this idea of God purifying us. It will go on burning within us after all that is foreign to us has yielded to its force, no longer with pain and consuming, but as the highest consciousness of life, the presence of God. And try to ponder that. It's saying that God loves us so much that He's willing to burn off the junk that doesn't belong there so that what's left is who we are meant to be. Right? And so you might think, well, that sounds kind of scary, to go into a refining furnace. But when we come out, we are so much better for it. So this priest who is pure himself makes us as his followers pure. He says something else seems kind of vague and innocuous. It says his feet were like burnished bronze, which had been made to glow in a furnace. Who cares about his feet, right? Unless you sell shoes, you're like, I'm not really thinking about his feet. But again, the readers, well, yeah, they know what that means. Another reference to the book of Daniel, okay? Daniel, so important to 1st and 2nd century Jews, all right? Remember, King Nebi had a dream about a gold-headed man, right? King Nebuchadnezzar had this dream, and this guy was made of all kinds of precious metals, and they get to his bodies. But when they got to his feet, it says his feet were made of clay. All right? A really vague thing. You're like, well, what is this about, Daniel? What are you telling me this for? And it was a reference to all the kingdoms that would come up against the nation of Israel. All these different kingdoms, okay? But because they were built on a feet of clay, they could never stand. So when John looks and sees this Son of Man, this priest, this pure one who makes us pure, he says his feet were made of bronze. His kingdom is going to stand. Okay? Right over our heads if we're not familiar, but his audience heard that. His kingdom is going to stand. It will not falter like the kingdoms of the earth. It says that in his hand He held 7 stars, okay? Not like ninja throwing stars, okay? 7 stars, this beautiful picture. You ever have one of those ninja stars? You throw it, and it always cuts your hand when you throw it. It's really weird. 7 stars, again, we're like, what does that mean? All right? In their world, they believed there were 7 celestial bodies that could be known. The sun, the moon, Venus, Jupiter, Mars, Mercury, and Saturn. Okay? They believed that the movement of these celestial bodies determined human fate. Right? Astrology. Some of you are still into that a little bit, and I'm not one of those, who's going to tell you that it's evil. It's kind of weird, I think. But that's what they believe, that this movement of these 7 stars determined human destiny. John is saying this Son of Man character is holding those stars in his hand. What is he telling us? The stars and the planets don't determine our destiny. We follow the one who controls the planets and the stars. And he goes on to give some more details about this vision that I'm not going to necessarily spend a lot of time unpacking, but I want us to jump back in and finish the rest of this chapter. Verse 17 says this, "When I saw him, I fell at his feet like a dead man." Happens all the time, it seems, when somebody in the Bible encounters God. "And he placed his right hand on me, saying, 'Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last, the living one. And I was dead, and behold, I am alive forevermore. I have the keys of death and of Hades.'" That's the right pronunciation. "Therefore, write these things which you have seen, and the things which are, and the things which will take place after these things. As for the mystery of the 7 stars which you saw in my right hand, they are 7 golden lampstands. The 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches." And why that is important, John is telling us this amazing vision of this Son of Man, this powerful one, is found in the churches. And it seems odd to us, because churches are flawed, aren't we? Somebody said it's kind of like Noah's Ark. If it weren't for the storm outside, you wouldn't be able to stand the stench on the inside. And so sometimes we feel that way about the church. We're narrow-minded sometimes. We're short-sighted. We can be judgmental. And yet, when John paints this picture of this amazing Son of Man, he said he's in the churches. Think about his birth, born in a manger. Think about his coronation, nailed to a cross. So of course he's going to associate himself with the flawed and with the broken like us. And so John's readers, hearers, typically these would be circulated to different communities. Somebody would read them out loud. They're hearing that. They're hearing, man, life is hard, but God is doing something. We're used to Jesus as this humble person nailed to a cross, and now he's being presented as the Son of Man, not come to open a can of stuff and destroy the world, but to come in the full power of God. These descriptions given to him, the first and the last, the Alpha and the Omega, the one who holds the keys to death, are descriptions that normally are only given to God the Father. And now Jesus has said, these are the descriptions of me, and I'm found in the church. So what I want us to do this morning is to go over to some of these tables here. I think there are about 5, so maybe about 10 at each table, okay? And there's some directions there. I want you to talk a little bit about what we've covered here this morning. I want you to share some of your ideas. There are questions. And then when it's said and done, I want you to take communion together. There's one table that has a little tray like this of bread. That's wheat-free, gluten-free, dairy-free bread. The rest of it has gluten, so if that's an issue for you, make sure you go to the table. It's right here, I think, with the gluten-free bread. Have some good discussions, get to know each other a little bit, and figure out how we can take this crazy but cool vision and apply it to our church and to our lives. Okay? Ready?